Jeanne Lambert was still wearing the pearl earrings Roderick had bought her for their anniversary when the voice note arrived. It came from Madison Vale. By mistake. Jeanne almost deleted it until she heard Madison laughing. She actually thinks he still loves her, Madison whispered. After the retreat, everyone will believe Jeanne is unstable. Roderick just needs her to look crazy before the divorce. Then the money, the promotion, the leak, everything stays protected. Jeanne's hands went cold. Her husband wasn't just cheating, he was planning to destroy her. So Jeanne forwarded the voice note to Roderick's boss with one sentence. I think you need to hear this. Before we go further, tell me if you receive proof like this, would you confront your husband first or send it straight to the one person who could ruin his plan? The next morning, Jeanne Lambert stood barefoot in her marble kitchen, staring at the coffee machine, while her entire life quietly unraveled behind her ribs. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, the Connecticut neighborhood looked painfully perfect. Trimmed hedges, white fences, luxury SUVs gliding silently past million-dollar homes. The kind of place where women smiled too brightly at charity brunches and husbands shook hands over whiskey while hiding affairs behind polished teeth. For 7 years, Jeanne had believed she belonged there. Now she wasn't sure if she had ever belonged at all. Her phone sat face down on the counter beside her. The forwarded voice note still existed somewhere inside Carolyn Whitmore's inbox, and Roderick still had no idea. Upstairs, the shower turned on. Jeanne closed her eyes. 7 years. 7 years of making herself smaller, so Roderick Hayes could become larger. She used to have ambitions of her own once, before marriage, before becoming the woman everyone described as Roderick's wife instead of Jeanne Lambert. She had worked in nonprofit communications in Boston when they met. She loved writing, loved strategy, loved the feeling of building something meaningful. But Roderick had entered her life like a storm, wrapped in expensive cologne and confidence. He made her feel chosen, special, safe, at least in the beginning. You're different from other women, he used to tell her. Back then, Jeanne thought it was love. Now she understood it had been the first brick in the cage. The shower upstairs stopped. Jeanne quickly grabbed her coffee mug as Roderick walked into the kitchen wearing gray slacks and an unbuttoned white dress shirt. Perfect hair, expensive watch, relaxed smile. He looked like the kind of man magazines called powerful, not dangerous. Morning, beautiful. He leaned down to kiss her forehead. Jeanne forced herself not to flinch. You left dinner pretty suddenly last night. I had a headache. You okay now? She nodded once. Roderick opened the refrigerator casually, like he hadn't spent months planning to destroy her reputation. Like another woman hadn't laughed about her humiliation through a voice note 12 hours earlier. You worried everyone, he said lightly. Madison, especially. Jeanne tightened her grip around the coffee mug. There it was again. Madison. Always Madison lately. At first, Jeanne had tried convincing herself she was imagining things. The late-night work dinners, the secretive texting, the way Madison laughed too hard at Roderick's jokes during company events. But intuition was strange. Women always knew long before they allowed themselves to admit it. You seem tense lately, Roderick continued. Maybe you should slow down a little. Slow down. Jeanne almost laughed. She handled everything in his life. His mother's medical appointments, his networking dinners, holiday planning, charity galas, travel schedules, birthday gifts for clients, even thank you cards to executives' wives. Roderick once joked to friends that Jeanne basically ran his world. The painful part was that he meant it. Without her, his life would collapse into chaos within a month. And somehow, he still treated her like she was replaceable. You know, he said carefully while pouring coffee, stress can make people imagine problems that aren't there. Jeanne looked at him slowly. There was something calculated in his tone, measured, like he was testing the ground beneath her feet. You think I'm imagining things. Roderick smiled softly. Too softly. I think you've been emotional lately. There it was. The word emotional. Not hurt, not exhausted, Not neglected, emotional. A pretty little label men used when they wanted women to doubt their own instincts. Jeanne swallowed carefully. You ever feel like maybe we've changed? She asked quietly. For a split second, something flickered behind his eyes. Fear. But it disappeared immediately. Everybody changes. He shrugged. Marriage isn't a movie, Jeanne. No, it wasn't. Movies usually had honesty. Roderick glanced toward the kitchen island, where his phone rested charging beside his laptop. You didn't use my computer yesterday, did you? The question came too fast, too casual. Jean's pulse stumbled, so he was nervous. Good. No, she said evenly. Why just looking for a file? Lie. Another lie layered on top of hundreds of others. He picked up his phone, and for one terrifying second, Jeanne thought he might already know about the voice note. But then his screen lit up. Madison. Did she hear it? Jeanne saw it clearly before he turned the phone over. Her stomach twisted so violently she thought she might actually vomit. Roderick noticed her expression. You okay? She forced a smile. Didn't sleep much. He walked toward her slowly, and suddenly Jeanne realized something horrifying. She didn't know this man anymore. Maybe she never had. The man standing in front of her looked like her husband, sounded like her husband, but beneath the polished surface was someone cold enough to orchestrate psychological warfare against the woman who had built his entire life beside him. Jeanne. His voice lowered gently. You know I love you, right? The question shattered something inside her. Because truly, cruel people always asked for reassurance while holding the knife. She stared at him. At the face she once trusted more than her own reflection. And for the first time in years, Jeanne stopped trying to save his feelings. What if love isn't enough? She whispered. Roderick's jaw tightened slightly. Then he smiled again. Controlled, polished, corporate. Don't spiral, okay, spiral. Another word, another subtle attempt to paint her as unstable. Jeanne suddenly remembered the voice note again. She actually thinks he still loves her. Her chest burned. She realized they had probably laughed about her for months, maybe longer. At dinners, in hotel rooms, during work trips, perhaps every time Jeanne defended him to friends, every time she protected his image, every time she stayed quiet after being hurt. Roderick checked his watch. I have an early meeting in the city. He grabbed his coat. We'll talk tonight. No, Jeanne thought. You'll talk. I'll listen, like I always did. He leaned down to kiss her cheek before leaving, and Jeanne stood perfectly still until the front door finally closed behind him. Silence flooded the house. Then her knees gave out. She collapsed onto the kitchen floor, one trembling hand covering her mouth to stop the sound that tried to escape her throat. Not because she still doubted the betrayal, but because she finally understood how deep it went. This wasn't an affair born from weakness. It was strategy, humiliation, erasure. Roderick wasn't trying to leave her. He was trying to rewrite her into the villain before he walked away. Jeanne stayed on the floor for several minutes, staring blankly at sunlight stretching across the marble tiles. Then slowly, she stood up. No screaming, no breaking plates, no desperate phone call begging for answers. Just silence. Cold. Precise silence. She walked upstairs to Roderick's home office. The room smelled like leather and expensive cologne. Everything was perfectly organized. Too organized. Jeanne opened the bottom drawer of his filing cabinet. Locked. Of course. But after 7 years of marriage, she knew where he hid the spare key. Inside the old Yale whiskey box behind his bookshelf. Her hands shook as she unlocked the drawer. Inside were folders, bank statements, private account records, property documents, and a thick envelope labeled Confidential Transfer Authorizations. Jeanne slowly opened it. Then her face went white, because the dates on the transfers started 6 months ago. 6 months. He had been planning this for half a year, long before the voice note, long before the anniversary dinner. long before he kissed her forehead this morning and called her beautiful. And suddenly, Jeanne understood something terrifying. Roderick Hayes hadn't just betrayed his wife. He had been preparing to bury her alive while smiling directly into her eyes. By the time evening arrived, Jeanne Lambert had already memorized the sound of Madison Vale's laughter. It haunted the walls of the house like smoke. Every room felt contaminated by it. The kitchen where Jeanne used to cook Sunday breakfasts. The dining room where she hosted charity dinners for Roderick's clients. Even their bedrooms suddenly felt staged, like a luxury hotel suite rented by strangers pretending to be married. Jeanne sat alone at the edge of the bed, while golden sunset light spilled across the hardwood floor. In her lap rested the transfer documents she'd found in Roderick's office. 6 months of hidden accounts. 6 months of careful planning. 6 months of lies told with soft kisses and expensive anniversary gifts. Her chest tightened. What hurt most wasn't even the affair anymore. It was the realization that Roderick had watched her love him sincerely while secretly preparing her destruction. A text message lit up her phone. Roderick dinner tomorrow with the Pierce group. Don't forget. Wear the black dress I like. Jeanne stared at the screen numbly. Not how are you. Not we should talk. Just instructions. Like she was still an accessory attached to his life. A few seconds later, another message appeared. Roderick. You've been distant lately. Let's not make things awkward in front of people. Jeanne let out a quiet laugh that sounded dangerously close to breaking. Awkward. He was worried about awkward. Not betrayal, not humiliation, not the fact that his mistress had accidentally exposed their entire scheme. Just appearances. Always appearances. Jeanne tossed the phone onto the bed and walked toward the bathroom mirror. For a long moment, she simply stared at herself. 36 years old. Beautiful in the understated way wealthy suburban women often were. Soft makeup, elegant clothes, controlled posture, years of training herself to appear calm no matter what she felt. But tonight her eyes looked different, sharper, like something inside her had finally stopped bleeding and started hardening instead. The next evening arrived cold and silver gray. Jeanne wore the black dress, not because Roderick asked her to, because she refused to let him see her shattered. The dinner took place at a private rooftop restaurant in Manhattan, overlooking the city skyline. Everything glittered, glass walls, candlelight, expensive watches, fake laughter. Corporate America at its most polished. Roderick rested one hand against Jeanne's lower back as they entered. To anyone watching, they looked perfect. Powerful husband, elegant wife, the dream. Jeanne wondered how many marriages in that room were quietly dying behind curated smiles. Jean Olivia Pierce hurried over, first air kissing her cheek. You look gorgeous. Olivia's eyes lingered half a second too long. Guilt. Jean noticed it immediately now. Once your heart broke open, you started seeing truths everywhere. Nathan Pierce approached beside his wife, already halfway drunk. There's the golden couple, he joked. Roderick smiled easily, trying to survive another quarter. Everyone laughed politely. Then Jean saw her. Madison Vale. She stood near the bar in a cream-colored silk dress with one hand curled around a martini glass. Beautiful, confident, sharp enough to cut skin without raising her voice. And when Madison saw Jeanne, she smiled. Not nervously, not guiltily, triumphantly. Jean suddenly understood something horrifying. Madison never believed she'd get caught, because women like her rarely were. Jean. Madison glided forward gracefully. I was worried about you after the anniversary dinner. Jean held her gaze. How thoughtful. Madison tilted her head slightly. You left so suddenly. Headache. Madison's lips curved. Stress can do terrible things to women. The exact same phrase Roderick had used. Jean felt cold rage crawl beneath her skin. They rehearsed this. They had discussed her, analyzed her, built a narrative together. Roderick appeared beside them, carrying champagne. There you two are. Madison touched his arm lightly, too naturally, too familiarly, and suddenly Jeanne couldn't stop noticing every tiny thing. The way Madison looked at him before speaking, the way Roderick subtly adjusted his posture near her, the invisible intimacy between people who believed they were smarter than everyone around them. Dinner began. Conversation floated between market trends, Hampton's properties, and political gossip. Jeanne barely tasted her food. Across the table, Evelyn Hayes sat draped in pearls and judgment. Roderick's mother had perfected cruelty so elegantly that most people mistook it for sophistication. Jean Evelyn said smoothly while cutting into her salmon. "Have you and Roderick reconsidered children yet?" There it was. The public humiliation ritual. Jean set down her wineglass carefully. "We've been busy." Evelyn sighed dramatically. Women always think they have more time than they do. Nathan chuckled awkwardly into his drink. Olivia looked horrified. Roderick didn't defend Jean. Of course he didn't. Madison leaned forward sympathetically. "I think Jean would make an incredible mother." The words sounded kind, but her eyes gleamed, like she enjoyed touching bruises just to hear people gasp. Evelyn smiled thinly. "If she ever learns to relax." The table laughed softly. Jean's stomach twisted. Not because of Evelyn anymore, but because Roderick sat there silently, allowing it. The same man who once promised he would protect her from everything. Another glass of wine arrived, then another. Madison turned toward Jeanne with fake warmth. "I still think about what you said at the Christmas gala." Jean frowned slightly. "I don't remember." Madison smiled wider. "You said your biggest fear was waking up one day and realizing the person beside you never really saw you." The blood drained from Jeanne's face. That conversation had happened privately, in Jean's own kitchen, months ago. Only Roderick had heard it. The entire table grew quieter. Even Nathan stopped eating. Roderick casually sipped his drink, like this was normal, like his mistress quoting his wife's deepest insecurities over dinner wasn't grotesque. Olivia stared at Jean with visible pity now, and suddenly Jean understood. They knew. Maybe not everything, but enough. Enough to pity her. Enough to watch her marriage rot in real time while pretending not to notice the smell. Jean felt humiliation climb her throat like fire. Madison leaned closer. "You're so emotionally intuitive, Jean. I admire that. Emotionally intuitive." Another polished insult. Another way to call her unstable without using the word directly. Jean looked at Roderick. He met her eyes calmly, and in that moment she realized something devastating. He expected her to break. That was the entire plan. Push her. Humiliate her. Corner her emotionally until she exploded publicly. Then they'd have proof. See Jeanne is unstable. See Jeanne is paranoid. See Jeanne is emotional. Suddenly, the entire evening transformed in Jeanne's mind. This wasn't dinner. It was psychological theater, and she was supposed to play the hysterical wife. But Jeanne had already heard the voice note. She already knew where the trap was hidden. So instead of crying, she smiled. A soft, terrifying smile. Madison blinked slightly. Roderick noticed immediately. What he asked carefully. Jean picked up her wine glass. "Oh, nothing." Her voice remained perfectly calm. "I was just thinking how fascinating it is when people accidentally reveal themselves." Silence spread across the table. Madison's smile faltered for the first time all night. Only for a second. But Jean saw it. And suddenly, for the very first time since hearing the voice note, Jean felt power return to her body. Small, fragile, but real. Roderick studied her carefully now, trying to understand what had shifted, trying to figure out why she wasn't reacting the way he expected. Good. Let him wonder. Let him feel uncertain for once. Dessert arrived, but nobody touched it. The tension had become visible now. Heavy, sharp-edged. Nathan finally cleared his throat awkwardly. "So, retreat next weekend should be fun." Madison recovered quickly. "Oh, definitely." She looked directly at Jeanne. "I think it'll be very revealing." Jane met her gaze without blinking. I agree. Something dangerous passed silently between them. Woman to woman, predator to prey. Except neither one fully understood anymore which role belonged to whom. Later that night, as they rode the elevator down to the parking garage alone, Roderick finally spoke. You were strange tonight. Jeanne stared ahead. Was I? You seemed cold. Cold. Interesting. Not emotional. Not unstable. Cold. The elevator doors opened. Jeanne stepped out first. And for the first time in 7 years of marriage, Roderick Hayes followed behind her uncertainly. Jeanne didn't sleep that night. She sat in the dark apartment of her mind long after the physical house went quiet, replaying every word from the dinner like it was evidence in a trial no one had officially announced yet, but everyone was already preparing for. Roderick had gone to bed beside her, breathing evenly, calm, as if he hadn't spent the evening watching his wife be psychologically dissected in public by his mistress and his mother, as if nothing had happened at all. That was what terrified Jeanne most now. Not the betrayal, not even the cruelty, but the ease of it. How naturally they all played their roles. Roderick as the controlled husband, Madison as the charming professional, Evelyn as the polished judge of her worth, and Jeanne as the quiet background character who was expected to smile and absorb it all. Her phone lit up at 2:13 a.m. unknown number, a voice note. Jeanne froze. Her instincts screamed not to open it, but she already knew. Some truths don't wait politely. They demand to be heard. She pressed play. Madison's voice filled the darkness like poison disguised as perfume. God, she actually believed you tonight, Madison laughed softly. I swear, Roderick, it's almost sad, but it's perfect. After the retreat next week, she's going to look completely unstable in front of everyone. Emotional collapse, jealousy, paranoia, it's all going to line up. Jean's hand tightened around the phone. Madison continued. And once Carolyn signs off on the internal review, we can push the narrative that Jeanne had access to the files because she was, what did you call it, over-involved and emotionally compromised. A pause. Then a quieter laugh. You're brilliant, honestly. Moving the money first was genius. By the time she realizes what's happening, she won't even have leverage. Jeanne stopped breathing. Money, files, narrative. This wasn't just cheating. It was construction. A carefully built structure designed to collapse on her specifically. Madison's voice softened into something almost affectionate. She'll probably cry first. She always does that thing where she tries not to cry in front of people. It's kind of pathetic. A faint sound in the background, Roderick laughing. Low, comfortable, familiar. Jeanne felt something inside her crack open, not loudly, not dramatically, but cleanly, like glass finally reaching its breaking point. Madison added one last thing. Oh, and I think we should make sure she forwards something she shouldn't. Give her enough rope. You know? The voice note ended. Silence rushed in violently. Jeanne didn't move, didn't cry, didn't speak, because something inside her had shifted into a place where emotion no longer came first. Pattern came first. Strategy came first. Survival came first. She got out of bed carefully, like any sudden movement might alert reality that she was no longer playing along. Roderick turned slightly in his sleep. Jeanne, he murmured. She stopped, waited, but he didn't wake fully, just rolled back over. Jeanne stood there in the dark, staring at him. The man she had defended for years. The man she had protected from consequences, from reputational damage from his own worst instincts. And now he was building a case against her like she was a threat to be eliminated. She walked into the living room. Her hands were steady now. Too steady. She opened her laptop. And for the first time since their marriage began, Jeanne did not think about being a good wife. She thought about being precise. By morning, Jeanne had made a decision. She didn't confront Roderick. She didn't scream. She didn't cry in the bathroom like Madison expected her to. Instead, she started building something quietly: a file, a timeline, a collection, every email, every bank transfer, every inconsistency, every moment where Roderick's story didn't align with reality. At 8:04 a.m., Roderick walked into the kitchen wearing a tailored suit, scrolling through his phone. "Morning," he said casually. "You okay? You didn't sleep much?" Jeanne looked at him over her coffee. "I'm fine." He studied her for a second, longer than usual. "You've been quiet." "I've been thinking." "About what?" Jeanne smiled slightly. "Work things." Roderick relaxed immediately. That was all it took. Work things. Not marriage things. Not betrayal things. Just acceptable distance. He kissed her cheek and grabbed an apple. "I have a meeting in the city," he said. "Don't forget dinner with the Whitmores tomorrow. Madison will be there." Jean's hand paused slightly around her mug. "Of course she will." Roderick didn't notice. He never noticed the exact moment when someone stopped being emotionally available to him. That was his blind spot. He saw usefulness, not disappearance. After he left, Jeanne sat alone at the kitchen island. The house felt different now. Not warmer, not colder. Just revealed. Like a stage after the audience realizes the actors have been lying the entire time. Her phone rang. Grace Callahan. Jeanne answered immediately. "I got it," Jeanne said before Grace even spoke. A pause. Then Grace's voice sharpened. "You heard it?" "Yes." Another pause. Then Jeanne, "Don't confront him." "I'm not." "What are you going to do?" Jeanne looked out the window. A neighbor was walking their dog. Normal life? Ordinary life. The kind that kept going even when someone's entire world was collapsing quietly behind closed doors. "I'm going to make sure," Jeanne said slowly, "that when this falls apart, it doesn't fall on me." Grace exhaled. "That's good. That's very good. Because what you're dealing with is premeditated, not emotional." Jeanne closed her eyes briefly. That word again. Premeditated, like a crime. Not a mistake, not an affair, a plan. After the call ended, Jeanne went upstairs to Roderick's office. The door felt heavier today. Not physically, emotionally. Inside, everything still looked perfect. Too perfect. She opened his filing cabinet again, but this time she wasn't searching blindly. She was confirming. Patterns, names, accounts, dates, and then she found it. A second folder, hidden behind tax documents, labeled Project Lark Internal Restructure. Jeanne opened it, and her stomach dropped. It wasn't just financial planning, it was narrative planning. Talking points, draft statements, pre-written explanations for HR, pre-framed language for Jeanne's instability, even sample emails suggesting she had been confused and emotionally overwhelmed. They weren't reacting to her, they were scripting her. Jeanne slowly sat down. The room tilted slightly, not from shock, but from clarity. This was not a marriage collapsing. This was a coordinated exit strategy, and she had been the sacrifice point. Her phone buzzed again. This time, Roderick. "Roderick, can you confirm dinner with Madison tomorrow? I want everything smooth." Jeanne stared at the message. Smooth. Always smooth. She typed back slowly, "Jeanne, yes, everything will be smooth." She hit send. And for the first time, she didn't feel like she was lying. She felt like she was agreeing to a battlefield. That night, Roderick came home later than usual. Jeanne was already in bed, eyes open in the dark. He slipped under the covers beside her. "Long day," he said. "Mm-hmm." He paused. "You're being weird again." Jeanne didn't respond immediately. Then quietly, "I'm just tired." Roderick sighed. "Jeanne, don't spiral, okay?" There it was again. The word he used when he didn't want her thoughts to exist. She turned slightly toward him. In the dark, her voice was calm. "I won't." Roderick smiled faintly and kissed her shoulder. "Good." And he fell asleep. Jeanne stayed awake, listening, breathing. planning. Because somewhere between that voice note and this moment, Jeanne Lambert had stopped being afraid of losing Roderick Hayes and started being afraid of what she would do next. The next morning arrived like nothing had changed. Sunlight spilled through the bedroom curtains in soft, indifferent gold. Birds outside the window moved through their routines as if betrayal was not something that could exist in a world this carefully landscaped. Jeanne Lambert stood in front of the mirror for a long time without moving. Her reflection looked normal. That was the most disturbing part. Normal skin, normal eyes, normal woman. And yet inside her, something had already crossed a line that could not be uncrossed. Behind her, Roderick Hayes adjusted his tie in front of the closet mirror. "Big day," he said casually. "Board updates, dinner with Madison. Try not to be in your head tonight, okay?" Jeanne blinked slowly. "Not in your head," as if her thoughts were a place she wandered into by accident. "Sure," she replied. One word. Flat. Controlled. Roderick smiled, faintly satisfied, like he had successfully stabilized a situation that might have become inconvenient. He walked over and kissed her cheek. "I love you," he said automatically. Not emotionally. Habitually. Jeanne didn't respond for half a second too long. "Then I know." Roderick paused, studying her. Something in her tone didn't sit right with him, but it was already too late in his schedule to investigate discomfort. So he left. The door closed, and the silence that followed didn't feel empty anymore. It felt populated. Jeanne waited exactly 3 minutes before moving. Then she went upstairs. Not to cry, not to break, but to confirm. Roderick's office was exactly as she left it. Too organized, too clean. A space designed by someone who believed control could prevent consequences. Jeanne closed the door behind her and locked it. Then she pulled out her phone, opened a new voice memo, and listened. Madison's voice from the night before filled the room again. "Once Carolyn signs off on the internal review, we can push the narrative that Jeanne had access because she was emotionally compromised." Jeanne stopped the recording. She replayed it again, this time slower, listening not like a wife, but like evidence technician. Then she did something she had never done in her marriage. She started recording everything around her, not just the voice note, but Roderick's world. His system, his structure, the drawers, the folders, the hidden financial documents, the Project Lark file. She took photos, screenshots. She labeled everything. Her hands were steady, too steady. At 8:47 a.m., her phone buzzed. "Grace Callahan." Jeanne answered immediately. "You didn't sleep?" Grace said, not as a question. "No." A pause. Then Grace's voice sharpened. "Jeanne, listen to me carefully. If what you're describing is accurate, this is not just betrayal. This is pre-litigation narrative construction. They are building a case against you before you even know you're in court." Jeanne closed her eyes. "I know." Another pause. Grace exhaled slowly. "Okay. Then we stop reacting like a wife and start acting like a subject of a case file. You understand?" Jeanne opened her eyes. "Yes." "Good. First rule, no confrontation. No emotional escalation. No private discussions with him alone." Jeanne glanced toward the hallway. Roderick was gone. But his presence wasn't. It lingered in the structure of the house like a surveillance system she had only just learned existed. "I already stopped reacting," Jeanne said quietly. Grace hesitated. "That's new. I'm observing now." A longer silence. Then Grace's voice softened slightly. "Jeanne, that's actually dangerous for them?" Jeanne didn't respond, because she was starting to understand something uncomfortable. She was no longer afraid of Roderick. She was studying him. At 6:12 p.m., Roderick returned home earlier than expected. Jeanne was in the kitchen preparing dinner, something simple, performative, believable. He loosened his tie as he walked in. "You okay?" he asked. Jeanne didn't turn around immediately. "Yes. You've been distant. I've been busy." Roderick walked closer. There was a shift in his energy now. Subtle, controlled, but sharper than before, busy with what Jeanne placed the knife down carefully, thinking. He exhaled lightly, almost amused. Jeanne, you don't need to think this hard about everything. There it was again. That sentence. The foundation of their entire marriage. Don't think too much. Don't question too much. Don't see too clearly. Jeanne turned to face him. For the first time in years, she looked directly at him without softening her expression. What did Madison mean? She asked calmly when she said I would look unstable after the retreat. The temperature in the room changed instantly. Not visibly, but perceptibly. Roderick blinked once, then smiled slightly. Madison says a lot of things. Jeanne nodded slowly. And the financial transfers. A pause. Longer this time. Roderick's expression remained controlled, but something behind it tightened. I think you're misunderstanding things. I found the documents, Jeanne said. That stopped him. Completely. For half a second, his mask slipped. Then it rebuilt itself. Carefully. I was going to tell you, he said smoothly. Jeanne studied him. There it was. The pivot, the soft landing, the rehearsed explanation, always just late enough to be believable. You were going to tell me about moving money 6 months ago, Jeanne asked quietly. Roderick's jaw tightened slightly. This isn't what you think? Jeanne nodded again, strangely calm. That's what Madison said too. A flicker of reaction crossed his face. Madison's name landed differently now, because it wasn't just an affair anymore. It was exposure. Roderick stepped closer. Jeanne, he said carefully, lowering his voice, you're overwhelmed. You've been reading things out of context. Out of context. Another familiar phrase. Jeanne almost smiled. He reached for her arm. Instinctively. Control disguised as reassurance. Jeanne didn't step back. She simply looked at his hand, and something in her stillness made him hesitate before touching her. That hesitation changed everything, because Roderick Hayes was not used to women who did not respond predictably. I think you should sit down, he said. I am sitting down, Jeanne replied. Silence stretched between them. Then Roderick's phone vibrated on the counter. Once, twice. He glanced at it. Jeanne saw the name before he turned it face down. Madison Vale. Of course, he didn't pick it up. But he didn't move away either. And Jeanne understood something with perfect clarity in that moment. They were still actively coordinating. Even now. Even here. While standing in front of her. I have a dinner tonight, Roderick said finally, as if returning to a normal script. We should not escalate things before then. Jeanne tilted her head slightly. That sounds important. It is. More important than this conversation. A pause? Then yes. Honest. Finally honest. Jeanne nodded once. I see. Roderick looked relieved for half a second. Mistake. Because Jeanne wasn't backing down. She was aligning. That evening, Jeanne wore a simple black dress again. Not because he asked. Because she needed to look like the version of herself they had built their plan around. Quiet, compliant, predictable. At 7:03 p.m., they arrived at the restaurant. Madison was already there, waiting, smiling. Perfect posture, perfect timing, like she had rehearsed the scene. Roderick leaned toward Jeanne as they entered. Remember, he whispered, just keep things light tonight. Jeanne looked at him, for a fraction of a second longer than necessary. Then she smiled. I always do. But this time, it didn't reach her eyes. And somewhere across the room, Madison Vale noticed it immediately. Her smile sharpened slightly, because women like Madison could always recognize the moment prey stopped behaving like prey. And that was the moment everything began to shift. The restaurant was too quiet for what was about to happen. Jeanne Lambert noticed that first. Not the chandeliers, not the wine list, not even the way Roderick Hayes held himself like a man still in control of a story he had already started rewriting. No. It was the silence between people who already knew more than they were saying. Madison Vale stood as they approached the table. Perfect smile, Perfect posture. Perfect timing as always. Jean Madison said warmly, like they were friends instead of enemies, being politely staged in public. You look beautiful tonight. Jean met her eyes. I could say the same. It wasn't warm, but it wasn't emotional either. That subtle difference made Madison pause for half a second longer than usual. Roderick slid into his seat easily, like nothing in his world had shifted. Glad you could make it, he said to both of them. We needed this night to feel normal. Normal. Jean almost laughed. Normal was a word people used when reality started slipping. Madison leaned slightly forward, resting her hands on the table. I was just telling Roderick earlier, she said, glancing at him briefly, how important tonight is for the retreat planning. Jean nodded slowly. Retreat planning, she repeated. Yes, Madison said smoothly. Corporate alignment sessions can get intense, especially with personalities involved. Personalities. Not people, not wives, not husbands. Personalities were easier to manage. Jean picked up her wine glass but didn't drink. Across from her, Roderick watched her carefully. Not lovingly, not nervously, analytically, like he was trying to measure deviation in behavior. Jane's been a little overwhelmed lately, he said casually to Madison. Work stress. You know how it is. Madison tilted her head sympathetically. Oh, I understand completely. Emotional load can really distort perception. There it was again. That language. Distort. Perception. Emotional. All words designed to make Jean sound unstable without ever saying it directly. Jean set her glass down gently. I've been thinking about perception a lot lately, she said. Both of them looked at her. Madison smiled faintly. Have you? Yes, Jean replied, especially how easily it can be constructed. A flicker passed over Madison's face. Quick, controlled, but real. Roderick leaned back slightly. Jeanne, he said softly, maybe tonight isn't the best time for heavy conversations. Jeanne turned her gaze to him. For a moment, the version of herself that used to soften for him almost appeared. Almost. Then it disappeared. I agree, she said. That surprised him. Madison, too. Jean continued. I think tonight should be light. She looked at Madison, and honest. Silence dropped onto the table. Not loud, not dramatic, just heavy. Madison smiled again, but it was thinner now. I always appreciate honesty, she said. Jean nodded. I do too. Roderick glanced between them. Something about the energy was no longer aligning the way he expected. The conversation continued, but the rhythm was off now. Forced. Artificial. Every laugh too late. Every sentence slightly misaligned. Jean barely spoke after that. She listened, watched, noted. Madison mentioned the upcoming retreat again. This is going to be a defining moment for leadership visibility, she said, especially for those being considered for promotion. Her eyes briefly flicked to Roderick, then to Jean. A silent exclusion. Jean understood immediately. She wasn't part of the promotion conversation. She was part of the obstacle conversation. Roderick reached under the table and briefly touched Jean's knee, a warning disguised as affection. Don't react. Don't interrupt. Don't break the script. Jean slowly placed her napkin down. I'm going to use the restroom, she said calmly. Roderick nodded immediately. Of course. Madison smiled politely. Take your time. Jean stood, and as she walked away, she felt both of their eyes follow her. Not in concern, in evaluation. When she reached the hallway, she didn't go to the restroom. Instead, she turned into a quieter corridor near the private lounge area. Her phone was already in her hand. Grace Callahan answered on the second ring. Tell me you're not reacting emotionally, Grace said immediately. I'm not, Jean replied. A pause. Then Grace softened slightly. Good. Where are you, dinner? Another pause. I assume Madison is there? Yes. And Roderick? Yes. Grace exhaled slowly. Jean? Are they trying to isolate your emotional response tonight? Jean looked through the glass wall back at the table. Yes, she said simply. And are you giving them one? Jeanne paused. No. Grace's voice sharpened. Good. Because if what you told me about the retreat is accurate tonight, is rehearsal. They are testing how you behave under controlled humiliation. Jeanne watched Madison laugh softly at something Roderick said. It looked intimate. Rehearsed intimacy. Yes, Jeanne said quietly. I think they are. Then don't change your behavior pattern, Grace said firmly. Stay neutral. Stay predictable. Jean's eyes narrowed slightly. I think predictable is what they're counting on. Another pause. Then Grace said something different, then become something they don't know how to categorize. Jeanne absorbed that, slowly. Something like what? Something calm enough not to trigger escalation, Grace said, but aware enough to document everything. Jeanne looked down at her phone. Already recording. Already storing. Already collecting. I can do that, she said. Good, Grace replied. And, Jeanne? Yes. If they think you're breaking, let them believe it. Just don't actually break. Jeanne ended the call. When she returned to the table, Madison was mid-story about corporate restructuring. Roderick looked up at Jeanne immediately. You okay? He asked. Jeanne smiled lightly. Yes. She sat down, and something had shifted again. Not outwardly, but internally. Because now Jeanne understood the game. This wasn't just betrayal. It wasn't just manipulation. It was performance management. And she had been the only one improvising emotionally. Madison leaned forward slightly. So, Jeanne, she said gently, are you feeling ready for the retreat next week? Jeanne met her eyes. I think I am. Madison smiled. Roderick relaxed slightly. Good. They thought she was still inside the script. Jeanne picked up her wine glass again, and for the first time that night, she drank. Not because she was calm, but because she was calculating. Later, when the dinner finally ended, Roderick placed his hand on the small of her back again as they walked out. You did great tonight, he murmured. Jeanne looked forward. Did I? Yes, he said. Exactly how I needed. Needed. Not wanted. Needed. That word stayed with her longer than anything else. In the car, Madison texted Roderick twice. Jeanne saw the screen light up briefly before he turned it away. He didn't hide it quickly enough. Jeanne already knew what it said without reading it. The system was still active, still coordinating, still planning. And when they arrived home, Roderick kissed her cheek again at the door. I have calls, he said. Don't wait up. Jeanne nodded. I won't. He left. Jeanne stood alone in the entryway for a long moment. Then she walked upstairs, opened her laptop, and labeled a new folder, Retreat Full Structure. Inside it, she began compiling everything: messages, voice note segments, financial movements, behavioral patterns, names, dates, intent. Not as a wife anymore, but as someone documenting a system that had finally revealed itself completely. At 11:46 p.m., Madison sent another message. Jeanne didn't see it immediately, but when she did later that night, it was simple. Madison. She's adjusting faster than expected. Jeanne stared at it for a long time, then she saved it, and for the first time since this began, she didn't feel like the target. She felt like the observer. The morning of the retreat arrived with a strange kind of stillness. Not peace, not calm. Something more deliberate, like the world was holding its breath without realizing it was part of a setup. Jeanne Lambert stood in front of her suitcase, fully packed, perfectly organized, everything in its place, just like Roderick Hayes preferred her life to be. Controlled, contained, predictable. Behind her, Roderick was adjusting his cufflinks. You'll like the place, he said casually. It's good for optics. Big corporate presence this year. Jeanne zipped her bag slowly. Optics, she repeated. He smiled without looking at her. You know what I mean. Yes, she did. What he meant was performance. Every moment of this retreat was staged. Leadership panels, networking dinners, strategic visibility, and now apparently, Her emotional breakdown would also be part of the schedule. Jeanne looked at him. Madison is already there, she asked. Roderick paused half a second too long, then nodded. She's coordinating logistics. Coordinating. Of course she was. Jeanne picked up her bag. Let's go then. Roderick finally looked at her properly. There it was again. That subtle deviation in her tone he couldn't fully decode anymore. You're handling this well, he said. Jeanne smiled slightly. I'm trying. It wasn't a lie. It was something more dangerous. Partial truth. The drive to Vermont was quiet. Too quiet. Roderick made a few work calls. Jeanne watched the landscape shift from urban edges to wooded isolation. The farther they drove, the more she understood something simple. This place was chosen for containment. Beautiful isolation, controlled exits, private observation, a stage with no audience beyond the ones who mattered. When they arrived at the resort, Madison Vale was waiting near the entrance. Cream coat, perfect hair, confident posture. Like she had been born inside environments like this, Jeanne Madison said warmly as they approached. I'm so glad you made it. Jeanne studied her. You're early. Madison smiled. Always better to be ahead of schedule. Roderick placed his hand lightly on Jeanne's back again. The gesture was automatic now. Possessive, anchoring. Let's check in, he said. Inside the resort was warm, elegant, and expensive in a way that felt intentionally isolating. Wood accents, soft lighting, expansive windows showing endless forest. Beautiful, controlled, unreachable. Madison walked slightly ahead with Roderick, speaking quietly about scheduling sessions. Jeanne followed, observing, logging everything internally. Every interaction now felt like data, not emotion, data. That was the shift Grace had warned her about. Not to feel less, but to see more. In the main hall, other executives and spouses were arriving. Smiles, handshakes, polished conversations, and beneath it all, evaluation. Jeanne could feel it instantly. People were watching her, not directly, but indirectly, measuring her presence against rumors she had not yet been formally accused of. Madison turned slightly toward Jeanne. You'll be seated at table 3 for dinner, she said casually. It's a quieter table, good for reflection. Roderick nodded approvingly. Jeanne understood immediately. Isolation framed as care, always the same pattern. Sounds perfect, Jeanne said. Madison's smile tightened slightly. Good. She wasn't reacting as expected. That would bother her. Inside the afternoon conference room, leadership sessions began. Jeanne sat beside Roderick. Madison sat across the aisle, occasionally speaking to other executives, always returning her attention to Roderick at precise intervals. Jeanne noticed everything now. Timing, eye contact, duration, micro pauses, control signals disguised as casual behavior. At one point, Roderick leaned toward her. You okay? He whispered. Jeanne nodded. Yes. He studied her. Just stay close to me tonight, he added quietly. Not romantic, strategic. Jeanne understood that too. I will, she said, and she meant it. Just not in the way he thought. By evening, the atmosphere shifted. Dinner preparations began in the grand hall. Tables arranged in symmetrical precision, glassware aligned, lighting adjusted for aesthetic warmth. Everything engineered to feel natural. Madison appeared again before dinner, this time closer, more intentional. You look calm, Madison said to Jeanne. Jeanne tilted her head slightly. Should I not be a brief pause? Madison smiled. I think some people find change unsettling. Jeanne held her gaze. Change can be interesting. That landed. Jeanne saw it. A flicker. Madison wasn't used to ambiguity in her targets. Roderick joined them, interrupting the tension. Ready for tonight? He asked lightly. Madison nodded. Everything is set. Set. Jeanne noted that word. Set meant prepared, planned, structured. Roderick placed a hand briefly on Madison's shoulder. a gesture so natural it would have been invisible to most people. But Jeanne saw it now. Everything was visible now. Dinner began. Wine flowed. Soft corporate laughter filled the room. And then Caroline Whitmore stood. Jeanne felt the shift before anyone spoke. The room changed temperature without moving physically. Before we move into our recognition segment, Carolyn said calmly, "There's an internal matter we need to address." Roderick straightened slightly. Madison's smile stayed in place, but her eyes sharpened. Jeanne remained still. Caroline continued, "We've reviewed material concerning internal communication, integrity data handling, and behavioral conduct within leadership teams." A pause. "I want to be clear. This is not speculation." Silence spread. Jeanne watched Roderick carefully now. He was still composed, but only barely. Carolyn nodded toward the legal team seated nearby. "Please begin playback." Roderick's expression shifted instantly. Madison's hand tightened around her glass, and then the voice note began. Madison's laughter filled the hall. Clear, undeniable, unedited. "She actually thinks he still loves her." Jeanne didn't move. She didn't need to, because she had already heard it enough times to no longer feel shocked. But now everyone else was hearing it. Executives, spouses, board members, people who had known Roderick Hayes as a polished, promising leader. Now listening to him, described as part of a calculated emotional and corporate manipulation strategy. Madison's voice continued through the speakers. "We just need her to look unstable. Then everything falls into place." A ripple moved through the room, small gasps, shifts in posture, whispers forming before they were allowed to fully exist. Roderick stood abruptly. "That's manipulated," he said quickly. "This is taken out of." Carolyn raised a hand. "Sit down, Mr. Hayes." The tone was not loud, but absolute. Roderick froze. Jeanne finally looked at him, and for the first time he looked uncertain, not angry, not arrogant, uncertain. Madison leaned slightly forward. "This is absurd," she said quickly. "That audio is—" Authentic. Carolyn interrupted. Another pause. Verified metadata. Multiple sources. The room shifted again. Now it wasn't just shock. It was recalibration. People were rewriting their understanding of Roderick in real time. Jeanne felt something strange inside her. Not victory. Not satisfaction. Release. Because for the first time, the truth was no longer contained inside her alone. Carolyn turned slightly. "And there is one more detail." Roderick's jaw tightened. Madison's breathing changed. Carolyn looked directly at Jeanne. "You were correct to forward this." Jeanne nodded once. Calm, controlled, present. And in that moment, Roderick Hayes understood something terrifying. This was not a misunderstanding. This was exposure, complete. The silence after the recording ended felt violent. Not loud, not chaotic, worse. Controlled silence. The kind that existed in rooms where powerful people realized someone important had just fallen. Jeanne Lambert sat perfectly still at table 3 while executives around her avoided direct eye contact with Roderick Hayes. Across the room, Madison Vale's face had lost all warmth. Not panic yet, but calculation. Fast, desperate calculation. Caroline Whitmore remained standing at the front of the hall, composed as ever. "Mr. Hayes," she said calmly, "you and Ms. Vale will remain available for internal review until further notice." Roderick rose slowly from his chair. "This is completely inappropriate," he said. "You're presenting private conversations without context." "Private conversations." Jeanne almost smiled. Interesting choice of words from a man who had spent months planning to weaponize private narratives against his wife. Carolyn didn't blink. "The context," she replied, "is exactly the problem." A murmur moved quietly through the room. Roderick noticed it. Jeanne saw the exact moment he understood something irreversible. People were no longer looking at him with admiration. They were looking at him with caution. Madison finally stood too. "This is absurd," she said sharply. Are we really destroying careers over gossip and a manipulated audio file? Careers are rarely destroyed by a single recording, Carolyn replied evenly. Usually they're destroyed by patterns. That landed hard, because everyone in that room suddenly began reviewing their own memories. Late night meetings, rumors, tension, behavior. The puzzle pieces were rearranging themselves in real time. Roderick turned toward Jeanne then, finally, directly. His eyes weren't soft anymore. They weren't even angry. They were searching, trying to understand when he lost control of her. Jeanne held his gaze calmly. No tears, no trembling. And somehow that disturbed him more than any emotional reaction could have. "You sent it," he said quietly. Not a question. A realization? Jeanne tilted her head slightly. Yes. The simplicity of her answer shook him visibly. Because for years, Jeanne had always explained herself emotionally. Now she sounded certain. That was new. Madison stepped closer to Roderick instinctively. Small mistake. Too intimate. Too revealing. Several executives noticed immediately. Jeanne saw them noticing. Nathan Pierce looked like he wanted to disappear entirely. Olivia Pierce stared openly at Madison now with thinly concealed disgust. The room had changed sides. Not fully, not safely, but noticeably. Carolyn glanced toward the legal team near the side wall. Mr. Reed will coordinate next steps. Marcus Reed stood. Professional, controlled. Merciless in the specific way corporate attorneys often were. "We'll need all company devices surrendered tonight," he said. "This includes phones, laptops, and remote access credentials." Madison inhaled sharply. Roderick's jaw tightened, and Jeanne understood instantly they were scared of what investigators would find. "Good." Marcus continued. "Until the review concludes, both of you are suspended from strategic decision-making authority." There it was. The real humiliation. Not public embarrassment, loss of power. Roderick stepped forward suddenly. "This is insane." "Caroline, you're making decisions based on emotional." Careful Carolyn interrupted. One word. Ice cold. Roderick stopped speaking. The entire room watched, because for the first time, Roderick Hayes looked small. Not physically, socially, corporately. Emotionally, his authority had cracked. Madison recovered first. She always recovered first. "That recording proves nothing except a private joke, taken out of context," she said smoothly. Jeanne finally spoke again. "No," she said quietly. "It proves intent." Every head turned toward her. Jeanne stood slowly from her chair. Her black dress fell perfectly against her frame. Elegant. Controlled. Impossible to dismiss as hysterical. "You discussed financial transfers," Jeanne continued calmly. "Internal files, reputation management, psychological framing." Madison's expression hardened. "You're twisting." "You laughed about making me appear unstable." Jeanne interrupted softly. Silence. Not because she raised her voice, because she didn't. Controlled women frighten people more than emotional ones. Roderick stared at her now like he genuinely did not recognize her. And maybe he didn't, because the version of Jeanne he built his strategy around no longer existed. Madison folded her arms. "You're emotional right now." There it was again. The word emotional. The leash they kept trying to place around her neck. But this time, it failed completely. Jeanne looked directly at Madison. "No," she said evenly. "I was emotional before. This is clarity." Something flickered across several faces in the room. Respect. Even Carolyn's expression shifted slightly. Roderick took a step toward Jeanne. "Can we please do this privately?" Jeanne almost laughed at the irony. Private. Now he wanted privacy, after planning to publicly dismantle her mental stability. "I think we're past private," Jeanne replied. The room went still again, because everyone understood what she really meant. The mask was gone now. For all of them. Marcus Reed stepped between Roderick and Jeanne, subtly. Not aggressively, just enough. A quiet legal boundary, Roderick noticed. And humiliation flashed visibly across his face. Not heartbreak, not remorse. Humiliation. Because another man had instinctively positioned himself between Jeanne and him. Control was slipping everywhere at once. Madison suddenly grabbed her purse. "I'm leaving." "No," Marcus replied immediately. "You're remaining available pending review." Her eyes flashed. "You can't detain me." "No one is detaining you," Marcus said calmly. "But departure before compliance review will be documented accordingly." Madison looked furious now. Not elegant, not composed. Furious. And Jeanne realized something important. Madison had always mistaken cruelty for superiority. The second cruelty stopped working. There was very little underneath it. Roderick turned toward Carolyn one last time. "You're making a mistake." Carolyn looked almost bored. "No," she said quietly. "I made a mistake promoting people I thought had integrity." That one hit deepest. Jeanne saw it. Because Roderick cared about many things, but nothing more than being admired. The room slowly began dissolving into fragmented conversations. Executives whispering, spouses pretending not to stare, phones discreetly lighting up under tables. Corporate scandal moved faster than fire. Nathan finally approached Jeanne carefully. I didn't know it was this bad," he admitted quietly. Jeanne looked at him. "You knew enough." Nathan lowered his eyes immediately. Because that was the truth, wasn't it? People always knew enough. They just preferred comfort over intervention. Olivia stepped beside Jeanne a moment later. For the first time all evening, her voice sounded genuine. "I'm sorry." Jeanne nodded once. She appreciated it. But apologies after exposure always arrived cleaner than courage before it. Across the room, Madison was arguing quietly with Marcus. Roderick stood alone now. Completely alone. And suddenly, Jeanne remembered every night she cried in bathrooms so nobody would hear. Every dinner where she swallowed humiliation politely. Every moment she doubted her own instincts because he taught her to. And she realized something strange. She didn't want revenge anymore. Not the screaming kind, not the dramatic kind. Because watching the truth stand calmly in public was somehow more devastating. Roderick looked at her again from across the room. This time there was no charm left, only disbelief. "How long did you know?" he asked quietly when he finally approached again. Jeanne held his gaze. "Long enough? And you just waited?" Jeanne nodded. "Yes." Roderick looked shaken by that answer more than anything else, because patience meant intelligence, and intelligence meant threat. For years he convinced himself Jeanne was too soft to become dangerous. Now he understood the terrifying reality: kind women became frightening when they finally stopped protecting the people hurting them. Roderick leaned closer slightly. His voice dropped low. "You just ruined my life." Jeanne stared at him for a long moment, then finally said the one thing he never expected. "No, Roderick." Her voice was calm as winter glass. "You built this yourself." And for the first time since their marriage began, Roderick Hayes had absolutely nothing to say back. Jeanne Lambert left the ballroom before anyone could stop her. Not because she was overwhelmed, because she finally understood the difference between escaping and exiting. For years, Jeanne had escaped conflict quietly, apologetically, carrying guilt that never belonged to her. Tonight, she exited, calmly, deliberately, like someone walking away from a fire she did not start. The hallway outside the ballroom was silent, except for the distant murmur of corporate panic unraveling behind closed doors. Phones ringing, lawyers whispering, executives recalculating alliances in real time. Jeanne stepped onto the outdoor terrace overlooking the dark Vermont mountains. Cold air struck her face instantly. For the first time in weeks, she could breathe fully. The resort lights glowed behind her through massive glass windows. Beautiful, expensive, fragile, a perfect metaphor for Roderick's entire life. The terrace door opened. Jeanne didn't turn around immediately. She already knew who it was. Jeanne. Roderick's voice sounded different now. No performance left, no polished executive tone, just strain. She stared out into the darkness. He stopped a few feet behind her. Not too close. Interesting. Maybe even he finally sensed the distance between them now. You embarrassed me in there. Jeanne almost smiled. Embarrassed. That was still the word he chose. Not betrayed, not cruel, not wrong. Embarrassed. She turned slowly toward him. The cold wind moved strands of her hair across her face. You planned to destroy me, she said quietly, and you're upset about embarrassment. Roderick dragged a hand through his hair. It wasn't supposed to happen like this. Jeanne laughed softly. Actually laughed. Not because anything was funny, because the absurdity finally reached a point her nervous system could no longer process normally. You're right, she said. It wasn't. Roderick stepped closer. Jeanne, listen to me carefully. There it was again. The tone. The same tone he used for years whenever he needed her manageable. Controlled. You're blowing this out of proportion. She stared at him in disbelief. Out of proportion. Yes. His voice sharpened slightly. Madison exaggerated things. People joke. Conversations sound worse out of context. Jeanne watched him carefully. Even now, even after exposure, even after the recording, he still believed reality was negotiable. That recording included financial transfers, Roderick. That was strategic planning. You planned to frame me as emotionally unstable. You've been unstable lately. The words hit the air between them like broken glass. Silence followed instantly, because even he heard it this time. Too direct, too honest. Jeanne felt something inside her finally settle into certainty. Not anger anymore, not grief, truth. You really believe that, she whispered. Roderick exhaled heavily. I think you've become obsessive. Obsessive? Another label. Another attempt to rewrite her reactions instead of confronting his behavior? Jeanne shook her head slowly. No, she said quietly. I became aware. Roderick's jaw tightened. You always do this. Do what turned everything emotional. Jeanne stared at him for a long moment. Then something changed in her expression. Not pain, disappointment, deep, exhausted disappointment. That's the problem, isn't it? She asked softly. You think emotions make people unreliable, but the only dishonest person here is you. Roderick looked away first. That mattered. Jeanne noticed it immediately. For 7 years, she was always the one who looked away first. Not tonight. The terrace door opened again. Madison stepped outside. Of course she did. Even now she couldn't stay away from him. She stopped when she saw Jeanne still there. A brief flicker of irritation crossed her face. Then the mask returned instantly. We need to go inside, Madison said quietly to Roderick. Jeanne almost admired her composure. Almost. Roderick looked between them. Tension stretched visibly now. Madison folded her arms against the cold. This situation is escalating fast. Jeanne tilted her head slightly. You mean consequences? Madison's eyes narrowed. I mean narratives. There it was. Narratives. Always narratives. Never truth. Never accountability. Just positioning. Jeanne suddenly realized something chilling. People like Madison and Roderick didn't experience relationships emotionally. They experienced them strategically. Who had leverage? Who controlled perception? Who remained believable? And Jeanne had spent years trying to love people who treated human connection like brand management. Madison looked at Jeanne carefully now. You know, she said softly, you could still handle this privately. Jeanne laughed again, this time colder. Privately, she repeated, you discussed ruining my reputation over wine and conference calls. Madison's expression hardened. We were protecting careers. No, Jeanne said quietly. You were protecting yourselves. For the first time all night, Madison lost composure slightly. You have no idea how this world works. Jeanne looked at her calmly. No, she replied. I finally do. Silence, heavy, sharp. Then Madison made a mistake. A small one, but fatal. She looked at Roderick, not Jeanne, before speaking again. That instinctive alignment, that unconscious loyalty. It confirmed everything more loudly than the voice note ever had. Jeanne saw it, and so did Roderick. His face shifted instantly, because suddenly he realized something terrifying too. Madison was already calculating survival. Not love, not loyalty. Survival. Interesting. So the woman he risked everything for operated exactly the same way he did. Madison noticed his expression change. "You can't seriously be blaming me," she snapped quietly. Roderick stared at her. "You sent the recording. By accident. You were careless." Madison let out a sharp breath. "Oh, don't do that. Don't suddenly act like this was all me." Jeanne watched them carefully. The cracks were spreading now. Fast. Roderick lowered his voice dangerously. "You said you deleted it." "I thought I did. Clearly not." Madison stepped closer. And whose idea was the instability narrative, Roderick? That landed. Hard. Because now Jeanne was no longer watching lovers united against her. She was watching co-conspirators begin abandoning each other. The pressure had finally become heavier than the performance. Good. Jeanne wrapped her coat tighter around herself. The cold no longer bothered her. "You know what the saddest part is?" she asked quietly. Neither of them answered. Jeanne looked directly at Roderick. "I would have forgiven an affair." That visibly shook him. Madison too. Because it was true. Jeanne had loved him enough once to survive betrayal. But this, Jeanne continued softly, "You wanted me erased. Publicly, emotionally, professionally." Roderick opened his mouth. Nothing came out. Because there was no defense for that. Madison crossed her arms again. "You're acting like a victim." Jeanne looked at her. "No," she said calmly. "Victims don't usually survive long enough to document everything." That sentence changed the atmosphere instantly. Roderick's eyes snapped toward her. "What does that mean?" Jeanne held his gaze. "It means you underestimated me." For the first time since the retreat began, real fear appeared in Roderick Hayes's face. Not fear of losing Jeanne, fear of losing control of the story. The terrace door opened again. Marcus Reed stepped outside, professional as ever. "Mr. Hayes," he said evenly, "we'll need your devices tonight." Roderick didn't move. Marcus continued. "And legal counsel has advised that all relevant communications be preserved immediately." Madison went pale. Jeanne noticed. Interesting. Very interesting. Because there were messages somewhere they were terrified investigators would find. Marcus looked briefly toward Jeanne. Not pitying, respectful. "Mrs. Lambert," he said quietly, "Carolyn would like to speak with you privately." Jeanne nodded once. Then she looked back at Roderick, at the man who once convinced her she was difficult to love. And suddenly, she realized something profound. Cruel people often survived by making kind people question their worth, because confident women were much harder to manipulate. Roderick stepped toward her again. "Jeanne, wait." She stopped. Not for him. For herself. What his voice dropped lower. Almost desperate now. "You don't understand what happens if this goes public." Jeanne stared at him for a long moment, then finally said the one thing he feared most. "Yes," she replied softly. "I do." And this time, she walked away first. Caroline Whitmore's private suite overlooked the mountains. Floor-to-ceiling windows framed endless darkness beyond the resort lights, and for a moment, Jeanne Lambert stood silently near the entrance, trying to remember the last time she had entered a room without worrying about managing someone else's emotions first. Carolyn poured 2 glasses of water. Not wine, not champagne. Water. Practical, clear, intentional. "Sit," Carolyn said gently. Jeanne obeyed. For the first time all evening, exhaustion hit her fully. Not dramatic exhaustion. Not collapse. The quiet kind that settled into bones after adrenaline finally loosened its grip. Carolyn sat across from her, calm as ever. You handled yourself extremely well tonight. Jeanne stared down at the glass in her hands. I didn't feel calm. That's because calm and control are different things, Carolyn replied. Jeanne looked up slowly. Interesting. No one had ever explained that difference to her before. Roderick certainly hadn't. For years, he demanded emotional silence and called it stability. But silence wasn't the same thing as peace. Carolyn leaned back slightly. Marcus and legal are already securing internal communications. Jeanne nodded once, and Carolyn continued carefully. What we're finding is worse than I initially suspected. A heaviness settled in Jean's chest. Not shock anymore. Expectation. What kind of worse? Carolyn held her gaze directly. Your husband wasn't just preparing for divorce. Jeanne felt cold all over. He was preparing liability displacement. The words landed slowly. Corporate language. Clean language. Language designed to describe ugly things politely? Carolyn continued. There are internal messages suggesting concerns about a future investigation involving client data movement. Based on what we're seeing, you were positioned to become the most convenient explanation. Jeanne stared at her. So he was really going to blame me? Yes. No hesitation, no softening, just truth. And somehow truth hurt differently than suspicion. Because suspicion still left room for denial. Truth closed doors permanently. Jeanne looked out toward the dark mountains. I spent 7 years protecting that man. Carolyn was quiet for a moment. Women like you usually do? Jeanne frowned slightly. Women like me? Carolyn's expression softened just a fraction. Capable women who confuse endurance with love. That sentence cut deeper than Jeanne expected, because it felt accurate. Painfully accurate. For years, she thought loyalty meant staying, absorbing, forgiving, adjusting herself smaller every time Roderick needed more room for his ego. And somehow she never realized the relationship only functioned because she was constantly bleeding parts of herself into it. A soft knock interrupted them. Marcus Reed entered holding a tablet. His expression remained professionally neutral, but Jeanne noticed the tension around his eyes. We recovered deleted message chains, he said carefully. Carolyn gestured for him to continue. Marcus looked briefly at Jeanne. Then, there are conversations between Mr. Hayes and Miss Vale discussing strategies for documenting emotional reactions from you during the retreat. Jeanne closed her eyes slowly. Of course there were. Marcus continued. They specifically discussed provoking conflict in public settings. The room went silent. Jeanne felt strangely detached now, like she was listening to someone else's marriage being autopsied. Anything else? Carolyn asked. Marcus hesitated. Then yes? That one word changed the atmosphere immediately. Marcus looked directly at Jeanne this time. There are references to recording private arguments inside the home. Jeanne's stomach dropped. Suddenly, memories rearranged themselves. Roderick leaving his phone face up. Strategically calm conversations. Questions designed to provoke reactions. He wasn't just manipulating her emotionally. He was collecting material. Building narrative. Building proof. Her hands tightened around the glass. I knew it, she whispered. Marcus nodded slightly. He appears to have been preparing for potential reputational defense. Reputational defense? Another clean corporate phrase. Jeanne almost laughed. That was the thing about powerful people. They buried cruelty beneath elegant vocabulary until abuse sounded strategic. Carolyn leaned forward. Jeanne. Jeanne looked up. You need to understand something very clearly right now. Her tone sharpened slightly. You are no longer dealing with a marital crisis. You are dealing with risk management behavior from someone trying to preserve power. The truth of that settled heavily into Jeanne's chest, because suddenly everything made sense. Why Roderick always redirected conversations, why he minimized feelings, why he controlled perceptions so obsessively. Love had never been his primary language. Control was. A knock sounded again, this time sharper. Before anyone answered, the door opened. Roderick. Marcus immediately straightened. Carolyn's face hardened instantly. Roderick looked disheveled for the first time in years. Tie loosened, hair slightly messy, eyes darker than usual. Not broken. Threatened. "There you are," he said, looking directly at Jeanne. Caroline stood immediately. "This is inappropriate." Roderick ignored her completely. "Jeanne, we need to talk." "No," Caroline said firmly. "You need legal representation." Roderick finally looked at her. "With respect, Caroline, this is my wife." Jeanne felt something strange hearing that now. "My wife." Possession disguised as intimacy. Caroline's expression remained cold. "At the moment, she's also central to an active internal investigation." That landed hard. Roderick's jaw tightened visibly. He turned back toward Jeanne. "Can we please speak privately?" Jeanne studied him carefully. For years that tone would have worked. Urgent, controlled, slightly vulnerable. The voice of a man who knew exactly how to make her feel responsible for his emotional state, but now she saw the mechanism underneath it. And once you saw the mechanism, it stopped feeling like love. "I don't think there's anything left to say privately," Jeanne replied quietly. Something flickered across his face. Not sadness. Panic. Real panic. "Jeanne," he said more sharply, "you're making decisions emotionally right now." Marcus actually looked irritated by that. Interesting. Even he noticed the manipulation. Jeanne stood slowly. "No," she said calmly. "I'm making them consciously." Roderick stepped closer. "This situation is spiraling. You created the spiral. That recording was never supposed to become public. There it was. Not remorse for the behavior itself, only regret for exposure." Jeanne stared at him. "You still don't understand why this matters." Roderick looked exhausted now. "Because it was a conversation." "No," Jeanne replied softly. "Because it was a plan." Silence. Heavy. Final. For the first time, Roderick looked genuinely cornered. Not because Jeanne was yelling, because she wasn't. Calm women, terrified manipulative people. They couldn't redirect calm, couldn't weaponize it easily. Roderick ran a hand through his hair. "You're blowing up both our lives." Jeanne's expression didn't change. "You already did that." He stared at her, and suddenly his voice softened into something almost pleading. "We can still fix this." That nearly broke her. Not because she believed him, because once upon a time she would have. Carolyn stepped between them slightly. Subtle, protective, professional. "We're done for tonight," she said firmly. Roderick ignored her again. His eyes stayed locked on Jeanne. "You know me." Jeanne felt tears threaten finally. Not because she wanted him back, because she realized something devastating. She didn't know him. Not really. Maybe she never had. "I knew the version of you that needed me loyal," she whispered. "I don't know this version." That hit him harder than anger would have. Jeanne saw it immediately. Because manipulative people could survive hatred. But irrelevance terrified them. Roderick's face hardened slightly again. Defense mode returning. "Fine," he said coldly. "If this becomes public, don't expect mercy from legal." There he was. Finally. The real one. Not charming husband, not regretful partner, strategic survivor. Jeanne nodded slowly. "Thank you." Roderick frowned. "For what?" "For finally speaking honestly." The room went still. And for the first time in 7 years of marriage, Roderick Hayes looked at Jeanne Lambert like he realized he had completely lost the ability to control her. Jeanne Lambert left the resort before sunrise. No dramatic goodbye, no final confrontation in the lobby, just a quiet exit through glass doors while the Vermont sky still carried the cold blue shade of unfinished night. The car service Carolyn arranged waited outside. As Jeanne slid into the back seat, she glanced once at the resort behind her. From a distance, it still looked beautiful. Warm lights glowing through expensive windows, luxury hiding rot, just like her marriage had. The driver pulled away silently. And for the first time in years, Jeanne realized something strange. She had nowhere she actually wanted to go. Not home, Not yet. The Connecticut house suddenly felt contaminated by memory. Every room inside it belonged to a version of her that no longer existed. Her phone buzzed before they even reached the highway. Roderick. Of course. She let it ring. Then again. Then again. Finally, a voicemail notification appeared. Jeanne stared at the screen for a long moment before pressing play. Jean Roderick's voice said sharply, already frustrated, "You cannot just disappear in the middle of this. Legal is involved now. Corporate is involved. We need to align our stories before this gets worse." Stories. Not truth. Stories. Jean closed her eyes. Even now, he thought this was about damage control. The voicemail continued. "And stop talking to Caroline alone. She's turning this into something it doesn't need to become." Jean deleted the message immediately. Then another text appeared. Roderick. "We need to be smart right now." A second message followed seconds later. Roderick. "Please don't make emotional decisions." Jean stared at that one longer. Emotional decisions? Interesting. Because every destructive decision in this situation had been made by him. Affair. Manipulation. Financial concealment. Narrative construction. But somehow women were always accused of being emotional when they reacted to betrayal, not when men created it. The city skyline finally appeared in the distance. New York. Cold. Gray. Awake too early. Grace Callahan was waiting outside her office building when Jeanne arrived. One look at Jeanne's face, and Grace immediately understood everything had escalated. "You okay?" Grace asked softly. Jeanne considered lying. Instead, she answered honestly. "No." Grace nodded once. "Good. Honest is useful." They went upstairs together. Grace's office smelled like coffee paper and expensive candles, trying unsuccessfully to soften the atmosphere of divorce law. Jeanne sat on the leather couch while Grace reviewed documents on her tablet. For several minutes, only silence existed between them. Then Grace finally spoke. "He contacted you?" Jeanne nodded. "Multiple times." "What tone?" Jeanne gave a small, humorless laugh. Corporate panic with emotional garnish. That almost made Grace smile. Almost. "He's scared," Grace said. "He's angry." "Those are related?" Jeanne leaned back against the couch slowly. "I don't think he's sorry." Grace looked up immediately. "No," she said bluntly. "Men like Roderick are rarely sorry for harm. They're sorry for consequences." The truth of that settled heavily into Jeanne's chest, because she knew it was right. Roderick wasn't grieving their marriage. He was grieving loss of control. Grace turned the tablet toward Jeanne. "We need to discuss immediate strategy." The word strategy almost made Jeanne flinch now. Everything had become strategy. Marriage, love, reputation, survival. Grace continued. "I'm filing emergency protection on financial transfers this afternoon. Also temporary restrictions on asset movement." Jeanne nodded numbly. "Okay." And Jeanne, Grace hesitated slightly. "You need to prepare yourself emotionally for what comes next." Jeanne frowned. "What do you mean?" Grace held her gaze carefully. "When manipulative people lose control privately, they often escalate publicly." The room felt colder suddenly. "He'll try to destroy me anyway," Jeanne whispered. Grace didn't answer immediately, because they both already knew the answer. Yes. Probably. A sharp knock interrupted them. Grace frowned. "I'm not expecting anyone." Her assistant opened the office door carefully. "You have a visitor." Grace stood instantly. "Who?" The assistant hesitated. "Mrs. Evelyn Hayes." Jeanne went still. Of course. Of course Roderick sent his mother." Grace immediately looked furious. "You don't have to see her." But Jeanne slowly stood. "No," she said quietly. "I think I do." Evelyn Hayes entered the office wearing cream cashmere and pearls. Elegant as always. Controlled as always. Like cruelty dressed itself for brunch. Her eyes immediately found Jeanne. Not concerned. Disappointed. Interesting. Not because her son betrayed his wife, because Jeanne had become inconvenient. Jeanne Evelyn said smoothly, "This entire situation has become incredibly embarrassing." There it was. Embarrassing. Always the reputation first. Jeanne folded her arms slowly. "Good morning to you too." Evelyn sighed softly, as if burdened by Jeanne's inability to behave correctly. "You should never have involved Roderick's company." Grace visibly stiffened beside her. Jeanne stayed calm. "He involved his company when he planned to use me as liability protection." Evelyn waved one hand dismissively. "You're misunderstanding corporate politics." Jeanne almost laughed. "No?" She finally understood them perfectly. Evelyn stepped closer. "Men under pressure make mistakes." Jeanne stared at her. "A 6-month affair and a financial concealment plan aren't mistakes." Evelyn's face tightened slightly. "Marriage requires discretion." Grace stepped forward immediately. "No," she said coldly. "Abuse requires silence." The room froze. Evelyn looked offended now. "Excuse me," Grace didn't blink. "Your son orchestrated reputational manipulation against his wife. That's not marital conflict. That's coercive behavior." Evelyn's eyes flashed. "You lawyers always make everything ugly." Jeanne finally spoke again. "No," she said softly. "People just usually hide ugly things behind polite language." That hit. Evelyn turned sharply toward Jeanne. "I expected more loyalty from you." The sentence settled heavily into the room. And suddenly Jeanne understood something devastating. Women like Evelyn didn't raise sons to love women. They raised sons to expect emotional service from them, loyalty, silence, endurance, no matter the cost. Jeanne looked at Evelyn carefully. "For years," she said quietly, "I defended your son even when he hurt me." Evelyn crossed her arms, and now Jeanne inhaled slowly. "Now I'm defending myself." Silence. Real silence, because that sentence changed the entire structure of the conversation. Evelyn's expression hardened. "You'll regret humiliating him publicly." Jeanne met her gaze without fear. He humiliated himself. Evelyn looked genuinely shocked by that answer. Not because it was cruel, because it was independent. Women like Jeanne were never supposed to become independent inside the relationship structure. They were supposed to remain emotionally negotiable forever. Grace stepped toward the door. "I think this meeting is over." Evelyn looked at Jeanne one final time, and for the first time since Jeanne met her years ago, there was no superiority left in Evelyn's eyes, only uncertainty, because manipulative families always panicked when the quiet woman finally stopped asking for permission to leave. After Evelyn exited the office, fell silent again. Grace exhaled heavily. "You okay?" Jeanne stared toward the window overlooking Manhattan. "No," she admitted softly. Then after a long pause, "But I think I'm becoming someone he can't control anymore." Grace looked at her carefully, and for the first time since this nightmare began, Jeanne saw pride instead of pity in someone else's eyes. The divorce hearing took place 3 weeks later on a rainy Thursday morning in Manhattan. Jeanne Lambert stood outside the courthouse steps beneath a gray umbrella, watching rainwater slide down the stone columns like the city itself was exhausted by human dishonesty. Beside her, Grace Callahan adjusted the strap of her leather briefcase. "You ready?" Grace asked quietly. No. Jeanne wasn't ready. Not for the legal language. Not for seeing Roderick across a courtroom instead of across a dinner table. Not for watching 7 years of marriage reduced to exhibit statements and evidence folders. But readiness had stopped mattering weeks ago. Survival mattered now. Jeanne inhaled slowly. Yes. Inside the courthouse smelled like paper coffee and tension. Everything echoed. Footsteps, voices, fear. People moved through hallways carrying broken versions of their former lives in neat legal folders. Jeanne suddenly wondered how many women entered buildings like this believing they had failed. How many blamed themselves for relationships built on manipulation. Grace touched her arm gently, eyes forward. Jeanne nodded, Then she saw him. Roderick Hayes stood near the courtroom entrance beside his attorney Alan Brooks. Tailored navy suit, perfect posture, controlled expression. He looked exactly like the kind of man courts trusted instinctively. Successful, educated, calm. Dangerous men rarely look dangerous. That was part of the problem. When Roderick noticed Jeanne, something shifted behind his eyes. Not love, recognition, like he was still trying to locate the version of her he used to manage so easily. But that woman was gone now. Alan Brooks leaned toward Roderick and whispered something. Jeanne watched Roderick straighten slightly afterward. Performance mode? Grace noticed too. He's going to push emotional instability, she murmured quietly. Jeanne almost smiled. Of course he was. The script never changed. Inside the courtroom, Judge Rebecca Monroe presided with sharp eyes and the exhausted patience of someone who had seen every variation of human selfishness already. Jeanne sat beside Grace. Across from them, Roderick avoided looking directly at her for several minutes. Interesting. Maybe eye contact felt different now when lies no longer controlled the room. Proceedings began formally. Asset disclosures, property structure, preliminary statements. Everything sounded strangely clinical, considering the emotional wreckage underneath it all. Alan Brooks stood first. Your Honor. He began smoothly. This situation has unfortunately escalated due to emotional reactions surrounding a private marital issue. There it was. Jeanne closed her eyes briefly. Emotional reactions. Not betrayal, not manipulation, not strategic reputational harm, just emotional reactions. Grace rose immediately afterward. Your Honor, she said calmly, we intend to demonstrate a coordinated pattern of financial concealment, reputational manipulation, and premeditated narrative construction against my client. The courtroom shifted slightly. Even the judge looked more alert now. Good. Grace continued. This is not a case about emotional overreaction. It is a case about intentional destabilization. Roderick's jaw tightened visibly. Jeanne noticed. He hated losing control of framing because language mattered deeply to people like him. If Jeanne sounded emotional, he stayed credible. If Jeanne sounded precise, he became vulnerable. Alan objected immediately. Counsel is being inflammatory. Grace didn't even blink. No, she replied evenly. The evidence is inflammatory. Jeanne almost wanted to laugh. Almost. Judge Monroe motioned for Grace to continue. And that's when the documents began. Bank transfers, hidden accounts, timeline records, internal messages recovered from company systems. The courtroom air changed with every exhibit. Because patterns were difficult to explain away. One mistake could be defended. 20 coordinated actions could not. Alan attempted recovery quickly. Mr. Hayes moved funds as part of future planning concerns during marital instability. Marital instability, interesting phrase for cheating on your wife while planning financial concealment. Grace stepped closer to the bench. Your Honor. The financial transfers began months before Mrs. Lambert had any awareness of the affair. Silence. Sharp silence. Grace placed another document forward. And we also have evidence that Mr. Hayes discussed creating a narrative of emotional instability surrounding my client before initiating separation proceedings. Judge Monroe looked directly at Roderick then. Not warmly, not neutrally, evaluating. That mattered. Roderick finally spoke for the first time. I was concerned about Jeanne's emotional state. There it was. The old strategy. Jeanne almost felt tired hearing it now. Judge Monroe folded her hands. And your concern led you to discuss reputation management with another woman. Roderick hesitated. Small hesitation, but devastating. Alan intervened quickly. Private conversations between consenting adults should not be interpreted as legal conspiracy. Grace's expression sharpened slightly. Then perhaps the court would prefer the recorded discussion involving strategic emotional provocation at a corporate retreat. Alan immediately objected again. But Judge Monroe raised one hand. I'll review admissibility. Jeanne watched Roderick carefully now, and for the first time he looked nervous. Real nervousness. Not irritation, not frustration. Fear. Because the structure was collapsing. Not privately anymore. Officially. Publicly. Legally. Halfway through the hearing, Evelyn Hayes entered quietly and took a seat behind her son. Elegant as always. Cold as always. But Jeanne noticed something immediately. Evelyn looked older today. Stress had finally reached her too. Interesting how accountability aged people faster than cruelty ever did. Later, Alan called Evelyn forward briefly to reinforce Roderick's concerns about Jan's emotional behavior. Big mistake, because Evelyn overperformed immediately. She became increasingly paranoid, Evelyn said carefully. Suspicious. Emotional. Judge Monroe looked up from the file. When did this behavior begin? Evelyn paused. Several months ago. Grace stood instantly. Interesting, she said calmly, because the financial concealment began before that timeline. Evelyn froze. Just for a second. But it was enough. Grace continued smoothly. So, either Mrs. Hayes is mistaken, or the instability narrative developed after Mr. Hayes already began hiding marital assets. Silence exploded through the courtroom. Not loudly, but decisively. Evelyn looked toward Roderick instinctively. Wrong move, because it looked coached. Judge Monroe noticed immediately. Jeanne saw the exact moment the judge's perception shifted permanently. Then came the final fracture. Alan received a folded note from his assistant mid-hearing. His expression changed instantly. Sharp. Concerned. He leaned toward Roderick and whispered quickly. Roderick's face drained of color. Jeanne's pulse quickened slightly. Something had happened. Grace noticed too. What is it? She whispered quietly. Alan stood abruptly. Your Honor, we request a brief recess. Judge Monroe frowned slightly. Reason. Alan hesitated. Then, we've just received notice that Ms. Madison Vale intends to formally cooperate with the internal investigation. The room went still. Completely still. Jeanne looked at Roderick, and for the first time since this began, she saw betrayal happen to him. Real betrayal. His face went blank in the terrifying way people looked when they realized someone they trusted had chosen self-preservation over loyalty. Interesting. Madison was saving herself. Of course she was. Women like Madison didn't love men like Roderick. They aligned with them temporarily, until survival required something else. Roderick looked shattered. Not because he lost Madison, because he lost control of the alliance. Jeanne watched him carefully, and suddenly she understood something profound. This was the first moment in weeks where he actually felt what he had tried to make her feel. Uncertainty, exposure, abandonment. Judge Monroe called for recess. People stood slowly. Chairs shifted. Whispers spread immediately. Roderick remained seated, motionless. Jeanne rose calmly beside Grace. As she turned toward the exit, Roderick finally looked up at her. Not arrogant anymore, not polished, just stunned. And in that moment, Jeanne realized something unexpected. She didn't hate him anymore. She pitied him. Because men who built their entire identities around control always collapsed hardest when truth removed the audience. By the end of the month, Roderick Hayes no longer belonged anywhere comfortably. Not at the firm. Not in the Connecticut social circles that once praised him. Not even fully inside the version of himself he spent years constructing. Reputation was a strange thing. People called it fragile, but that wasn't true. Reputation could survive affairs, arrogance, cruelty, even dishonesty. What it rarely survived was exposure combined with documentation, and Jeanne Lambert had both. Rain fell steadily outside Grace Callahan's office the afternoon the settlement was finalized. Jeanne sat quietly at the conference table while attorneys exchanged final paperwork. No dramatic victory music, no triumphant speeches, just signatures, numbers, Assets divided like emotional wreckage translated into financial language. Grace slid the final document toward her. "You're officially free," she said softly. Free. The word felt unfamiliar, heavy. Jeanne signed her name slowly. Lambert, not Hayes. The realization hit her harder than expected. For years, she thought marriage had expanded her identity. Now she understood it had nearly erased it. Across the table, Alan Brooks avoided eye contact entirely. Interesting. Weeks ago, he spoke with smooth confidence. Now he looked exhausted. Even lawyers got tired carrying collapsing narratives. "Mr. Hayes has agreed to the revised settlement terms," Alan said professionally. Grace almost smiled at that. Agreed. As if Roderick still had leverage to negotiate from strength. The truth was much simpler. He was bleeding credibility too quickly to keep fighting publicly. The internal investigation at the firm had expanded. Madison Vale officially cooperated. 3 executives quietly distanced themselves from Roderick. And suddenly, invitations stopped arriving. That was how elite social circles punish scandal. Not loudly, silently. People simply stopped returning calls. Jeanne finished signing the final page. Alan gathered the paperwork quickly. "We'll process this immediately." Grace nodded once. After he left, silence settled across the office. Then Jeanne laughed softly. Grace looked up. Jeanne shook her head slightly. "I thought this would feel bigger." Grace leaned back in her chair. "It usually doesn't." Jeanne stared out the rain-streaked window. "That's depressing." "No," Grace said calmly. "It's healthy." Jeanne frowned slightly. Grace continued. "The end of suffering often feels quiet, especially when you spent years surviving noise." That stayed with Jeanne long after she left the office. The Connecticut house sold 2 weeks later. Fast. Too fast. Apparently, beautiful homes attached to scandal still moved quickly when located in wealthy zip codes. Jeanne walked through the empty rooms one final time before closing. The silence inside felt different now. Not haunted. Finished. She paused in the kitchen where she first listened to Madison's voice note. Strange how entire lives could split open in ordinary rooms. Behind her, footsteps approached softly. Roderick. Of course. Jeanne didn't turn immediately. "You're late," she said quietly. "I wasn't sure you'd come." She finally looked at him, and the difference startled her. Not physically. Roderick was still handsome, still polished, still dressed in expensive fabrics designed to signal importance. But something underneath had collapsed. Confidence used to radiate from him naturally. Now it looked performed, fragile, temporary. "Lawyers said we should finalize walkthroughs separately," Jeanne said. "I know." Silence stretched between them. Roderick looked around the empty house slowly. "No furniture," he murmured. "You kept most of it." Another silence. Then finally, "You really went through with everything." Jeanne almost laughed. Everything. As though she was the architect of destruction here. "You mean consequences." Roderick's jaw tightened slightly. "You know what I mean." "No," Jeanne replied calmly. "I actually don't anymore." That unsettled him. She could tell. Because Jeanne used to translate his emotional ambiguity for him. Now she refused. Roderick walked slowly into the living room. This house used to mean something. Jeanne looked around. Sunlight spilled across bare hardwood floors. The house looked larger, empty. Honest somehow. "No," she said softly. "I think I just worked very hard making it feel meaningful." That hit him. She saw it immediately. Because manipulative people depended heavily on other people creating emotional warmth around them. Without Jeanne's effort, the house was just architecture. Without Jeanne's loyalty, Roderick was just a man with expensive suits and very little emotional depth. He turned toward her slowly. "I loved you." Jeanne inhaled quietly. Once upon a time, those words would have destroyed her. Now they only made her sad. "I think," she replied carefully. "You loved being needed." Roderick looked genuinely wounded by that. "Good. Truth should wound sometimes." "You think I'm a monster now?" he asked quietly. Jeanne considered the question seriously. No, that surprised him. I think you spent so much time managing perception that eventually you stopped recognizing reality. Silence. Heavy. Honest. Roderick looked down briefly. Then Madison turned on me. There it was. Not grief over Jan, not regret over betrayal. Madison. Jean almost smiled at the predictability. What did you expect? She asked softly. She said we were a team. Jean looked at him carefully. You called us a team too. That landed harder than anything else she said, because for the first time, Roderick understood the full symmetry of it. He became the disposable person, the useful one abandoned after strategic value disappeared. The realization hollowed him visibly. Jean should have felt satisfaction. Instead, she felt tired, deeply tired, because revenge fantasies never included how emotionally exhausting the truth actually was. Roderick stepped closer, carefully. Do you know what people are saying about me? Jean met his eyes. Yes. His expression tightened. You don't care. The question hung strangely between them, and Jean realized something important. Roderick genuinely believed emotional care was permanent obligation, even after betrayal, even after manipulation, even after trying to destroy her. No, she answered honestly. That devastated him more than anger ever could have, because indifference was something he couldn't negotiate with. Outside, thunder rolled faintly across the sky. Roderick looked around the empty house again, then finally asked the question she knew was coming. Was forwarding the recording worth all this? Jeanne thought about it carefully. The humiliation, the legal battles, the exposure, the loneliness, the grief. Then she thought about the alternative, staying silent, allowing herself to become the scapegoat, remaining small enough for his comfort forever. Yes, she said quietly. Roderick stared at her for a long time. You changed. Jean shook her head slowly. No, she replied. I think I stopped abandoning myself. That sentence ended something permanently. She saw it happen inside him. Because suddenly, Roderick understood there was no version of this story where he regained emotional access to her. Not through charm, not through guilt, not through nostalgia. Jean picked up her coat from the counter. I should go. Roderick nodded slowly, but before she reached the door, he spoke again. Jeanne. She paused. His voice sounded smaller now. Human, finally. I really did lose everything. Jean looked back at him one last time. The empty house echoed around them. And suddenly, she understood the deepest tragedy of men like Roderick Hayes. They often confused losing control with losing love. No, Jean said softly. You lost the people you thought would stay no matter how badly you treated them. Then she opened the front door and walked out of the house forever. 6 months later, Jeanne Lambert no longer woke up afraid of silence. That surprised her most. For years, silence inside her marriage had felt dangerous, like the tense quiet before criticism, manipulation, or emotional withdrawal. Now silence felt clean, peaceful, earned. Her apartment overlooked the East River from the 23rd floor of a Manhattan building, filled with people who minded their business and never asked inappropriate questions over wine. The space wasn't enormous, but every inch of it belonged to her. The cream-colored couch by the window, the books stacked beside her bed, the framed black and white photographs she chose herself instead of selecting art that matched Roderick's image of sophistication. Even the air felt different, lighter somehow. Jean stood barefoot in the kitchen one rainy morning, stirring oat milk into coffee, while jazz played softly from a speaker near the window. No tension. No monitoring someone else's mood. No rehearsing conversations before they happened. Just existence. Simple existence. And after years of emotional survival, simplicity felt almost luxurious. Her phone buzzed against the marble counter. Grace. Jean smiled automatically before answering. Well, Grace said without greeting you, officially ignored Roderick for 30 consecutive days. Jean laughed softly. Is that a legal milestone now? It should be. Jeanne leaned against the counter. How is he? Grace exhaled. Tired, angry, publicly humbled, the usual. Jeanne listened quietly. Strange. There was a time hearing about Roderick's suffering would have emotionally consumed her entire day. Now it barely shifted her breathing. Grace continued. He tried to contest part of the settlement again last week. Jeanne rolled her eyes lightly. Of course he did. He lost. Another small silence. Then Grace's voice softened. How are you really? Jeanne looked out the window at the gray river below. The answer came slowly. Still healing. That's normal. I know. But healing was stranger than Jeanne expected. People always talked about heartbreak dramatically. Crying, collapse, loneliness. Nobody talked enough about the quieter parts. The identity confusion, the guilt for becoming harder, the terrifying realization that you ignored your own instincts for years just to keep someone comfortable. Some nights, Jeanne still woke up remembering Madison's laughter from the voice note. Some mornings, she still reached instinctively toward the empty side of the bed before remembering no one slept there anymore. Trauma didn't vanish because paperwork finalized. It unraveled slowly, thread by thread. After the call ended, Jeanne prepared for work. Not wife work, not emotional labor disguised as partnership. Actual work. 3 months earlier, Caroline Whitmore officially hired Jeanne as a strategic consultant specializing in corporate ethics communication and reputational crisis analysis. Irony had a strange sense of humor. The woman once positioned to become the scapegoat was now helping companies identify manipulation structures before they destroyed people. Jane still remembered her first meeting with Caroline after the divorce finalized. You noticed behavioral patterns faster than most executives, Caroline had told her. Jean almost laughed at the time. No, she just spent years surviving one. Now Jean walked confidently through glass office doors that once intimidated her. Employees greeted her by name, not Mrs. Hayes, Jeanne, only Jeanne. That mattered more than she expected. At noon, she met Carolyn for lunch at a quiet restaurant near Bryant Park. Carolyn studied her carefully across the table. You look different. Jeanne smiled slightly. Better or worse? More present. That stayed with Jean. More present. Interesting, because marriage to Roderick often felt like disappearing slowly while remaining physically visible. Carolyn sipped her tea. There's a women's leadership summit in October, she said casually. They want speakers. Jeanne blinked. I'm not a public speaker. Yes, you are. No, Jeanne corrected gently. I'm just someone who survived a disaster very publicly. Carolyn's expression sharpened slightly. Exactly. Jeanne looked down at her hands. The old version of herself would have immediately declined. Too visible. Too risky. Too much attention. But the old version of herself also spent years apologizing for existing too loudly. I'll think about it, she said. Caroline nodded once. Good. That evening, Jean attended therapy with Dr. Melissa Hart. At first, Jean hated therapy. Not because it wasn't helping, because it was. And healing forced honesty in ways survival never did. Dr. Hart sat across from her calmly. How have the nightmares been less frequent? And the guilt. Jean looked away slightly. There. Dr. Hart nodded. Guilt over what specifically? Jean hesitated. Then finally, missing him sometimes. Dr. Hart's expression didn't change. Missing familiarity isn't the same thing as wanting harm back. Jean absorbed that slowly. Interesting, because she still occasionally missed the rituals. Morning coffee together, shared routines, the illusion of partnership. But she no longer missed the emotional exhaustion attached to them. Dr. Hart leaned forward slightly. What do you miss about him specifically? Jean opened her mouth, then paused, and realized something startling. Very little. She missed the version of him she hoped existed, not the man he repeatedly proved himself to be. The realization sat heavily in her chest. Dr. Hart noticed. That's grief too, she said softly. Grieving imagined futures. After therapy, Jeanne walked home through Manhattan alone, beneath city lights, reflecting off wet pavement, and for once alone did not feel synonymous with abandoned. That mattered. Upstairs in her apartment, she changed into soft clothes and opened her laptop. Unread emails filled her screen. Work requests, scheduling notes. A message from Olivia Pierce thanking her again for showing more grace than anyone deserved. And one final unread message. From Roderick, sent 3 days ago. Jeanne stared at it for a long moment before opening it. Not because she missed him, because she no longer feared what his words might do to her emotionally. The message was short. I saw your interview clip online. You seem happy. Jeanne reread it twice. No manipulation, no blame, no performance. Just observation. Interesting. Then another line. I don't think I realized how much of our life was held together by you. Jeanne felt something ache quietly inside her. Not love, recognition, because that was probably the most honest thing Roderick Hayes had ever said. Their marriage survived as long as it did because Jeanne carried the emotional architecture of it alone. Without her effort, everything collapsed quickly. Jeanne closed the message. No reply. Not out of cruelty, out of completion. She walked toward the window overlooking the city. Rain shimmered across Manhattan streets, below like scattered silver, and for the first time in a very long time, Jeanne felt something unfamiliar growing inside her. Not revenge, not survival. Possibility, real possibility. The kind that only appeared after someone finally stopped shrinking themselves to fit inside another person's limitations. Her phone buzzed again, a new email notification. Women's Leadership Summit official speaker invitation. Jeanne stared at the screen. Then slowly, she smiled. Not the polite smile she wore for years at charity dinners beside Roderick. Not the careful smile designed to keep peace. A real one. Small. Quiet. But completely her own. The ballroom overlooking Central Park glowed gold beneath crystal chandeliers. Women in tailored suits and elegant dresses filled the space with the soft sound of conversation, ambition, and survival stories carefully hidden beneath polished appearances. Jeanne Lambert stood backstage, holding note cards she no longer needed. Her pulse was steady. That surprised her. A year ago, public attention would have terrified her. She spent most of her marriage trying not to take up too much emotional space. Now she understood something differently. Silence protected manipulators far more often than it protected women. You ready? Carolyn Whitmore asked beside her. Jeanne smiled softly. No. Carolyn laughed quietly. Good. The best speakers usually aren't. Across the ballroom, Grace Callahan lifted a hand toward Jeanne from her table. Dr. Melissa Hart sat beside her. Two women who helped rebuild pieces of Jeanne she thought were gone forever. Not by rescuing her, by reminding her she was never powerless to begin with. The event coordinator approached quickly. You're on in 30 seconds. Jeanne inhaled slowly, then stepped toward the stage lights. Applause filled the ballroom as her name appeared across the massive screen behind her. Jeanne Lambert, corporate ethics consultant and speaker, not Mrs. Hayes, not somebody's wife, just Jeanne. The realization almost made her emotional. Almost. She stepped to the podium. For a moment, she simply looked at the audience. Hundreds of women, executives, lawyers, founders, managers, women who looked composed enough to survive anything. Jeanne knew better now. Some of them were probably holding their lives together with invisible stitches no one else noticed. She adjusted the microphone gently. When I was younger, she began softly, I thought loyalty meant enduring almost anything. The ballroom quieted instantly. Jeanne continued, I thought love meant being understanding, forgiving, flexible, quiet. A few women nodded subtly already. Recognition. Jeanne saw it. But eventually she said carefully, I realized something dangerous. She paused. Some people mistake your kindness for permission to mistreat you. Silence settled deeply now. Not empty silence. Listening silence. Jeanne glanced briefly at her notes, then pushed them aside completely, because none of this lived on paper anymore. It lived in her bones. I spent years trying to become easier to love, she said. Smaller, calmer, less emotional, less complicated. Her voice remained steady, but the truth was, I was never difficult. A woman near the front visibly swallowed hard. Jeanne noticed. And suddenly, she understood something profound. Pain became lighter the moment someone else finally named it out loud. I was reacting normally. Jeanne continued quietly to being manipulated. The room stayed completely still. No phones moving, no glasses clinking, nothing. Just women listening with the kind of attention only truth could command. Jean's chest tightened slightly. Not from fear, from release. People talk a lot about betrayal, she said. Affairs, lies, humiliation. A pause. But the most damaging betrayal isn't always cheating. Now even the waitstaff had stopped moving. It's when someone slowly teaches you to distrust your own reality. That landed hardest. Jeanne felt it move through the room, because too many women understood exactly what she meant. You start apologizing for your instincts, she continued. You start minimizing your pain so someone else can remain comfortable. Her voice softened. And one day you wake up exhausted from carrying a relationship that only survives because you keep bleeding pieces of yourself into it. A woman in the second row quietly wiped tears from her face. Jeanne saw her, and for the first time, she no longer felt ashamed of what happened to her. Because survival wasn't embarrassing, silence was. In my case, Jeanne said carefully, I eventually discovered that the person I trusted most had built an entire narrative around making me appear unstable. A ripple moved quietly through the ballroom. No names, no details, but enough truth to breathe. And the strange thing about manipulation, Jeanne continued, is that it works best on people with empathy. That surprised some people. Jeanne could tell. Because empathetic people question themselves first. She smiled sadly. They assume misunderstanding before malice. The room stayed silent. Deeply silent now. Jeanne looked toward the massive windows overlooking Manhattan lights. A year ago, she would have given anything to save her marriage. Now she understood she had actually been trying to save herself inside it. I used to think healing meant becoming softer again, she admitted quietly. Then she shook her head slightly. No. A small smile touched her lips. Healing meant becoming honest. That line earned soft applause. Jeanne continued anyway. It meant accepting that boundaries are not cruelty. More applause. It meant understanding that documentation is not vindictiveness. A louder reaction this time. And it meant realizing that leaving toxic love is not failure. Now the applause grew stronger. Real. Emotional. Not polite corporate applause. Recognition applause. Jeanne inhaled slowly. Then said the final truth she carried for an entire year. The most powerful moment of my life wasn't when the people who hurt me finally faced consequences. Silence returned immediately. It was the moment I stopped needing them to understand my worth. The ballroom erupted, not loudly at first, then fully. Women standing, clapping, some crying openly now. Jeanne stepped back slightly from the podium, overwhelmed for the first time all evening. Not by pain, by connection. Backstage afterward, people surrounded her, thanking her, confessing things quietly. One woman whispered, I thought I was crazy too. That almost broke Jeanne's heart. Almost. Later that night, after the ballroom emptied and the city quieted beneath midnight rain, Jeanne finally stepped outside alone. Cold air brushed against her skin. Peaceful. Real. Her phone buzzed once inside her coat pocket. Unknown number. Jeanne stared at it for a moment before opening the message. Roderick. Of course. The text was short. I didn't know what you were worth until everyone else saw it. Jeanne read it once. Then again. A year ago, those words would have destroyed her. Months ago, they might have healed something temporarily. Tonight, they simply felt late. Jeanne looked up at the Manhattan skyline glowing against the dark sky. And suddenly, She understood the final lesson Roderick Hayes unknowingly gave her. People who only value you after losing access to you never truly valued you properly to begin with. She deleted the message calmly. No anger, no revenge, no dramatic satisfaction, just completion. Then Jean slipped her phone back into her coat pocket and started walking through the city lights. Not as someone abandoned, not as someone broken, but as a woman who finally returned to herself after years of disappearing inside someone else's story. And for the first time in a very long time, the future no longer frightened her. Some of the deepest wounds in life don't come from strangers. They come from the people we loved enough to trust blindly. And sometimes the hardest truth to accept is that being kind, loyal, and patient does not guarantee you will be treated with kindness in return. Jeanne's story is not just about betrayal. It's about what happens when a woman spends so many years trying to keep a relationship alive that she slowly disappears inside it. Like many people, she confused endurance with love. She thought staying quiet made her strong. She thought sacrificing more would eventually make someone appreciate her value. But real love should never require you to abandon yourself. One of the most powerful lessons in this story is that manipulation often sounds soft. It hides behind phrases like, you're too emotional, you're overthinking, or let's keep this private. And over time, those words can make even the strongest person question their own reality. That's why self-trust matters so much. The moment Jeanne stopped asking permission to believe her own instincts was the moment her healing truly began. And maybe that's the real victory here. Not revenge. Not watching Roderick lose his career or reputation. But Jeanne finally understanding that her worth was never dependent on whether someone chose her, stayed loyal to her, or recognized her value too late. Healing begins when you stop shrinking yourself to fit inside toxic love. It begins when you realize boundaries are not cruelty. It begins when you finally choose yourself without guilt. If this story touched you in any way, share your thoughts in the comments. Do you think Jeanne did the right thing by forwarding the voice note? What would you have done in her position? And if you enjoy emotional stories about betrayal, healing, karma, self-worth, and women reclaiming their lives, don't forget to subscribe and join us for the next journey. Sometimes a story isn't just entertainment. It's a reminder that you deserve better too.